What happens when people judge a book by its cover? Sometimes they miss the most beautiful story ever written. This is mine. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. I stood in the parking lot of Miller & Associates law firm, adjusting my tie for the third time in 2 minutes. The Denver morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant hum of traffic from downtown. My hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from what I was about to do. Today was the day I'd been preparing for since I graduated law school. Today, I would finally tell the truth about Martha and Joe Peterson, the couple everyone in Riverside had spent years mocking. The couple who changed my life in ways no one could imagine. My phone buzzed. A text from my colleague Sarah. "Good luck today, Marcus. You got this." I smiled despite my nerves. If only she knew how much this presentation meant to me. How it wasn't just about winning a case or impressing partners. It was about setting the record straight. The glass doors of the firm reflected my image back at me. A 28-year-old black man in a sharp navy suit, briefcase in hand, looking every bit the successful attorney I'd worked so hard to become. But underneath that polished exterior was still the scared, angry 12-year-old boy who'd arrived at the Petersons' doorstep with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a heart full of rage. I pushed through the doors and made my way to the elevator. Today's presentation was for the Henderson Foundation, a major client considering a massive donation to foster care programs across Colorado. They wanted to hear success stories, real testimonials about the impact of foster care. When my boss had asked for volunteers, I'd surprised everyone, including myself, by stepping forward. The elevator dinged, and I stepped out onto the 15th floor. The conference room was already set up, afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the Rocky Mountains. In a few hours, this room would be filled with Foundation board members, fellow attorneys, and local foster care advocates. "Marcus, there you are." Jennifer Walsh, the senior partner, approached with her usual brisk efficiency. "Are you ready for this?" The Henderson people are particularly interested in personal stories. They want authenticity, real emotional connection. "I'm ready," I said, though my voice came out slightly hoarse. She studied my face with the sharp attention that had made her one of Denver's most successful attorneys. "You seem nervous. That's not like you. In 3 years here, I've never seen you anything but confident in presentations." I set my briefcase down on the polished conference table. "This one's different, Jennifer. This one's personal." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. That was one thing I appreciated about her. She knew when to give people space. As she left to handle other preparations, I found myself alone in the conference room, staring out at the mountains. My mind drifted back 15 years to a very different view from a very different window. The trailer park in Riverside wasn't exactly picturesque. Situated on the outskirts of Denver, it was the kind of place people drove through quickly, windows rolled up, eyes forward. The trailers were old, some dating back to the 1970s, with faded aluminum siding and patches of rust that told stories of hard winters and harder lives. That's where Martha and Joe Peterson lived. Trailer 47, in the back row, next to the rusted fence that separated the park from an abandoned lot where weeds grew taller than my head. I'd arrived there on a Thursday in September, my third foster placement in 2 years. My caseworker, Mrs. Rodriguez, had given me the usual speech during the drive. "This couple is very nice, Marcus. They've been fostering children for over a decade. I think you'll really like them." I'd stopped believing those speeches after the first 2 placements had ended in disaster. Foster parents who wanted the monthly check but not the responsibility. Foster parents who saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a kid who needed help. When Mrs. Rodriguez's car pulled up to the small blue and white trailer, I'd felt my heart sink even lower than usual. The yard was cluttered with old furniture and what looked like car parts. A rusty basketball hoop stood at an odd angle, its net long gone. 2 lawn chairs sat on the small front porch, their plastic seats faded from years of sun exposure. This was it. This was supposed to be my new home? Martha Peterson had emerged from the trailer before we'd even gotten out of the car. She was a large woman, probably in her late 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a faded Denver Broncos t-shirt and jeans with grass stains on the knees. Her smile was wide and genuine, but I'd learned not to trust smiles from adults. "You must be Marcus," she'd said, approaching the car with arms outstretched. "We've been so excited to meet you." Joe had followed behind her, a thin man with work-weathered hands and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was wearing what looked like a mechanic's uniform, his name embroidered over the left pocket. They'd both seemed nice enough during the initial meeting, but I'd thought that about my previous placements too. As Mrs. Rodriguez completed the paperwork and handed over my meager belongings, I'd stood there planning my escape route, just like I always did. What I hadn't planned for was what happened next. "Marcus," Martha had said after Mrs. Rodriguez left, "I know this is scary. New places always are. But I want you to know something right now, before anything else happens." I tensed, waiting for the rules, the threats, the warnings about behavior and consequences that usually came next. Instead, she knelt down to my eye level. This woman who barely knew me, in her stained clothes and cluttered yard, had looked me directly in the eyes and said 6 words that would change everything. "You're wanted here, Marcus. Always." The conference room door opened, pulling me back to the present. Sarah poked her head in, her red hair catching the afternoon light. "The Henderson people just arrived," she said. "Jennifer wants to start in 10 minutes. You ready?" I nodded, straightening my tie one more time. "Yeah, I'm ready." But as she left and I gathered my notes, I couldn't shake the memory of that first day with Martha and Joe. How naive I'd been to think I understood what kind of people they were based on where they lived and what they owned. How naive everyone in Riverside had been. The first few weeks at the Petersons had been a careful dance of mistrust on my part and patient kindness on theirs. I'd been through enough foster homes to know the routine. Keep your head down, don't get attached, and always be ready to leave. But Martha and Joe were different in ways that confused and frustrated my 12-year-old cynicism. Every morning, Martha would wake up at 5:30 a.m. to make breakfast, not just cereal or toast, but actual breakfast. Scrambled eggs, bacon, sometimes pancakes shaped like cartoon characters that made me want to smile despite myself. Joe would sit at the small kitchen table, reading the newspaper aloud and making comments about the Broncos' chances that season. "What do you think, Marcus?" he'd ask, including me in conversations about sports, current events, or whatever random topic struck his fancy. "Think they've got a shot at the playoffs?" I'd shrug and mumble something non-committal, but inside I was shocked. Adults didn't usually ask for my opinions on anything. After breakfast, Joe would drive me to Roosevelt Middle School in his beat-up 1995 Ford pickup truck. The truck was loud, with a muffler that announced our arrival from 2 blocks away, and had more rust than paint. I'd sink low in the passenger seat, embarrassed by the attention it drew. That embarrassment only got worse when I realized that several of my classmates lived in the nice neighborhoods we drove through to get to school. Split-level houses with manicured lawns, 2-car garages, and basketball hoops that weren't held up by prayer and duct tape. "See you after school, son," Joe would call out as I climbed down from the truck, his voice carrying across the drop-off zone. Several kids would turn to look, and I'd feel my face burn with shame. "Son," he'd started calling me that within the first week, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The embarrassment reached a peak during my 3rd week there, when my English teacher, Mrs. Campbell, assigned a project about family traditions. We were supposed to interview family members and present our findings to the class. I'd approached Martha nervously that evening, finding her in the small living room, mending one of Joe's work shirts. "I have this project," I'd said, explaining the assignment. "Oh, how wonderful," Martha had exclaimed, setting down her needle and thread. "Joe, come here. Marcus wants to interview us about family traditions." Joe had emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Family traditions, huh? Well, let's see." They'd spent the next hour telling me stories I'd never heard before. How they'd met at a church potluck dinner 25 years ago. How they'd started taking in foster children after they discovered they couldn't have biological children. How every Christmas, they made homemade gifts for everyone in the trailer park who didn't have family nearby. "But why do you do it?" I'd asked, genuinely puzzled. "Taking kids like me, I mean. It's not like you're getting rich from it." Martha and Joe had exchanged a look that seemed to contain an entire conversation. "Because everyone deserves to be loved, Marcus, Martha had said simply, and everyone deserves a chance to love someone back. The presentation had gone well enough in class, but the real trouble started afterward, in the hallway between periods. "So you live in a trailer?" Jessica Martinez had asked, loud enough for several other students to hear. Jessica was one of those kids who seemed to have been born knowing exactly where she fit in the social hierarchy, and she made it clear that foster kids from trailer parks weren't anywhere near her level. "Yeah," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "With those old people? Are they like your grandparents or something?" "They're my foster parents." The word foster had hung in the air like a neon sign advertising everything that was wrong with my life. Foster kids were different. Foster kids were problems. Foster kids came from bad situations and went to worse ones. "Oh," Jessica had said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "That's so sad. Do they make you do chores and stuff to earn your keep?" Behind her, I could see other kids gathering, drawn by the scent of drama the way vultures circle roadkill. "It's not like that," I'd said, but my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "I heard they taken kids for the money," said Blake Morrison, a kid whose parents drove BMWs and owned one of the big houses in Cherry Creek. "My mom says foster parents get paid by the state." "That's not true," I protested, but even as I said it, I wondered if it was. Did Martha and Joe get money for taking care of me? Was that why they'd been so nice? The group had dispersed when a teacher approached, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew quickly in the fertile soil of my insecurities. That afternoon, I'd ridden home in Joe's loud truck in silence, stewing in embarrassment and suspicion. When we pulled into the trailer park, I'd noticed things I hadn't paid attention to before. How the other residents looked at us. How some of the trailers had broken steps or missing skirting. How the whole place had an air of impermanence, like everyone was just passing through on their way to somewhere better. "You okay, son?" Joe had asked as we'd walked toward the trailer. "You seem quiet today." "I'm fine," I lied. But I wasn't fine. I was angry and confused and ashamed of being ashamed. That night, lying in the small bedroom that Martha had decorated with superhero posters and a comfortable bed, I'd made a decision. I was going to find out the truth about Martha and Joe Peterson. I was going to figure out why they really took in foster kids, and I was going to protect myself from whatever disappointment was coming. Because in my experience, disappointment always came eventually. What I didn't know then was that I was about to embark on a journey that would teach me the difference between seeing and understanding, between judging and knowing, between being smart and being wise. And it would all start with a conversation I'd overhear 3 days later that would turn my world upside down. The conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon in October. Martha and Joe thought I was in my room doing homework, but I'd actually been in the bathroom when I'd heard voices coming from the kitchen. Something about the tone, serious, hushed, had made me pause and listen. "Getting harder every month, Joe." Martha's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "The electric bill alone." "I know, sweetheart. I know." Joe's voice was tired. "Maybe I can pick up some overtime at the shop. Henderson said they might need extra help with the winter prep. You're already working 60 hours a week. You can barely keep your eyes open when you get home." I'd pressed closer to the bathroom door, my heart pounding. Were they talking about money? About me being too expensive? What about the car payment? Martha continued. "We're already 2 weeks behind. We'll figure it out. We always do. But Joe, what if we can't? What if—" Martha's voice had cracked. "What if we can't afford to keep him?" The bottom had dropped out of my world. Keep me? They were thinking about getting rid of me because I cost too much money? I'd slip back to my room and close the door quietly, my hands shaking. All those breakfasts, all those suns, all those family traditions, it was all just temporary. Just like every other placement. The next few days had been torture. I'd watched Martha and Joe carefully, looking for signs that they were preparing to send me away. Every whispered conversation felt like a conspiracy. Every glance between them seemed loaded with secret meaning. By Wednesday, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront them, to at least have some control over when and how I left. But as I'd walked toward the kitchen that evening, I'd heard voices again. This time, Martha was on the phone. "I don't care what the state pays us, Carol. It's not about the money, and it never has been." I'd frozen in the hallway. "No," Listen to me, Martha had continued, her voice firm. Marcus is not going anywhere. I don't care if we have to eat ramen noodles for the next 6 months. That boy has been through enough, and he's finally starting to trust us. Martha's right. I'd heard Joe say in the background. We'll figure out the money situation, but Marcus stays. End of discussion. He's family now, Carol, Martha had said, and I could hear tears in her voice. You don't give up on family because times get tough. I'd stood there in the hallway, stunned. They weren't trying to get rid of me. They were trying to figure out how to keep me despite their financial struggles. Look, Martha had continued, I've got some jewelry I can sell. My grandmother's ring, maybe the necklace Joe gave me for our anniversary. And we can cut back on groceries, maybe cancel the cable. No, Joe had interrupted. You're not selling your grandmother's ring. I'll talk to Henderson about that over time, and maybe I can pick up some weekend work at Murphy's garage. Joe, you can't work 7 days a week. You'll kill yourself. Better than giving up on that kid. He's been abandoned enough for one lifetime. I'd backed away from the kitchen, my eyes burning with tears I'd tried so hard not to shed for the past 4 years. These people I've been embarrassed by, these people who lived in a trailer park and drove a rusty truck, were willing to sacrifice everything they had to keep me. But the revelation that had shattered my misconceptions was still coming. The next day at school, I'd been distracted during lunch, picking at my sandwich and thinking about what I'd overheard. That's when I noticed Blake Morrison and Jessica Martinez at the next table, talking loudly enough for me to hear. Did you see that old truck in the parking lot this morning? Blake had said. It was like smoking or something. So embarrassing. That's the foster kid's ride, Jessica had replied. I feel so bad for him. Imagine having to live with those people. My mom says trailer park people are usually on drugs or something, Blake had continued. She says that's why they can't afford real houses. I'd stood up so fast that my chair had scraped loudly against the floor. What did you say? I'd asked, walking over to their table. Blake had looked up, surprised by my tone. I was just saying, you don't know anything about them. I'd interrupted, my voice getting louder. You don't know anything about Martha and Joe. Chill out, man, Blake had said. I wasn't trying to. They work harder than your parents ever will. I continued, the words pouring out of me. Joe works 60 hours a week at an auto shop, and Martha cleans houses for people who probably treat her like garbage. And you know what? They still make me breakfast every morning. They still help me with homework. They still ask about my day like they actually care about the answer. The cafeteria had gotten quieter, other students turning to watch the show. And that truck you're making fun of? Joe bought it used 15 years ago, and he's kept it running with his own hands because he's too busy taking care of other people to buy himself something nice. And that trailer you think is so embarrassing? It's the first place I've ever lived where people told me they loved me and actually meant it. Jessica had looked uncomfortable. Marcus, we didn't mean. Yes, you did, I'd said. You meant exactly what you said. You think they're beneath you because they don't have as much money as your parents. You think I should be embarrassed by them. I looked around the cafeteria at all the faces staring at me, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Something hard and angry and ashamed had cracked open, and what came out was something I'd never felt before. Fierce, protective love. But you want to know the truth? I'd said, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. Martha and Joe Peterson are better people than any of you will ever be. They've taken in 17 kids over the past 12 years. 17 kids that nobody else wanted. And they don't do it for money. They do it because they think every kid deserves a family. I turned back to Blake and Jessica, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. So yeah, I live in a trailer park. Yeah, Joe's truck is old and loud. Yeah, we shop at thrift stores and clip coupons, and sometimes eat the same thing 3 nights in a row. But Martha and Joe chose me. Not because they had to, not because someone paid them enough to make it worth their while, but because they wanted me to be their son. The word son had come out stronger than I'd expected, and I'd realized as I said it that it was true. Somewhere in the past month, without me even noticing, I'd started thinking of them as my parents. My real parents. And if that embarrasses you, I'd finished. Then I feel sorry for you. Because you'll never know what it's like to be loved like that. I'd walked out of the cafeteria then, my heart pounding, but my head held high. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up for someone else. For the first time in my life, I defended the people who loved me. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what family meant. The aftermath of my cafeteria speech had been both better and worse than I'd expected. Better because several students had approached me over the following days to tell me they thought what I'd said was cool. Worse because Blake and Jessica had made it their mission to make my life difficult whenever possible. But something fundamental had changed in me that day. I'd stopped hiding from Joe's truck when he picked me up. I'd stopped mumbling when people asked where I lived. And most importantly, I'd started paying attention to who Martha and Joe really were, not just how they appeared to the outside world. What I discovered amazed me. Martha didn't just clean houses. She was practically running a one-woman social service agency. Every Tuesday, she visited Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who lived alone 3 streets over, bringing groceries and staying to chat. Every Thursday, she babysat for the Rodriguez family so Maria could attend her English classes at the community college. Every weekend, she cooked extra food and distributed it to families in the trailer park who were struggling. How do you know who needs help? I'd asked her one Saturday as we loaded containers of homemade soup into the truck. You just pay attention, sweetheart, Martha had replied. Mrs. Thompson's lights have been off more than usual, probably behind on her electric bill. The Johnson kids have been looking thin lately, probably stretching the food stamps too far. Mr. Patterson's been walking instead of driving his car, probably can't afford gas. But how do you afford to help everyone? Martha had smiled, that warm smile that had confused me so much when I'd first arrived. We make do with less so others can have a little more. That's what neighbors do. Joe was the same way. I'd started hanging around his auto shop after school, partly because I was genuinely interested in learning about cars, but mostly because I wanted to understand this man who called me son like it was the most natural thing in the world. What I discovered was that Joe Peterson was something of a legend in Riverside. At least half the cars he worked on belonged to people who couldn't afford to pay him. He'd fix their cars anyway, sometimes accepting payment in homemade meals or help with yard work, sometimes accepting no payment at all. Mr. Peterson, I'd said one afternoon as we worked on Mrs. Garcia's ancient Honda, why do you fix cars for free? Don't you need the money? Joe had looked up from under the hood, his face streaked with grease. Marcus, let me ask you something. If you saw someone stuck on the side of the road with a broken-down car, and you knew how to fix it, would you drive past just because they couldn't pay you? Well, no, I guess not. Same principle applies here. People need their cars to get to work, to take their kids to school, to get to the doctor. If I can help, I help. The money works itself out. But the most eye-opening revelation had come in November, when I'd finally worked up the courage to ask Martha about the conversation I'd overheard about money. Martha, I'd said one evening as we worked on my homework together, are you and Joe having money problems because of me? She'd looked up from the math worksheet she'd been checking, surprise evident on her face. What makes you ask that, honey? I told her about overhearing their conversation, about my fears that they were going to send me away. Martha had listened without interrupting, her expression growing more understanding with each word. When I'd finished, she'd been quiet for a long moment. Then she'd reached across the table and taken my hands in hers. Marcus, she'd said gently, Joe and I have been having money problems since long before you came to live with us. We've been having money problems for most of our marriage. You know why? I'd shaken my head. Because we've never been very good at putting ourselves first. When Joe sees a car that needs fixing and the owner can't pay, he fixes it anyway. When I see a family that needs food, I cook extra. When we hear about a kid who needs a home, we open our door. She'd squeeze my hands gently. The state does pay foster families a small amount each month, Marcus. But that money doesn't cover half of what it actually costs to raise a child. We've always known that. Every family who does foster care knows that. We do it anyway, because some things are more important than money. But what if you can't afford to keep me? I'd asked, voicing the fear that had been eating at me for weeks. Martha's eyes had filled with tears. Sweet boy, we will never not be able to afford to keep you. We might have to eat more beans and rice. We might have to keep wearing our clothes until they fall apart. We might have to give up cable television and eating out and new shoes. But we will never, ever give up on you. But why? I pressed. I'm not even your real kid. Oh, Marcus. Martha had stood up and come around the table, pulling me into one of her fierce hugs. You are absolutely our real kid. Not because we made you, but because we chose you. And you chose us back. That conversation had happened 3 weeks before the incident that would change everything between me and the rest of Riverside. The incident that would make everyone see Martha and Joe the way I'd learned to see them. It had started with a fire. The Hendersons lived in Trailer 23 toward the front of the park. Mike Henderson worked construction when he could find work, and his wife, Sarah, took care of their 3 young children. They were one of the families Martha regularly brought soup to, and Joe had fixed their car more times than I could count. The fire had started around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in December. Faulty wiring, the fire department would later determine. By the time anyone noticed the flames, half the trailer was already engulfed. I've been awakened by shouting and the smell of smoke. By the time I got dressed and made it outside, it seemed like the entire trailer park was gathered in the small space between trailers, watching the Henderson place burn. That's when I'd heard Sarah Henderson screaming, "Lily! Where's Lily? Has anyone seen Lily?" Lily was their 4-year-old daughter. In the chaos of evacuating, no one had thought to check if all 3 children had made it out. "She's probably still in there," Mike had said, starting toward the burning trailer. 2 neighbors had grabbed him, holding him back from running into what was essentially a wall of flame. "The fire department's on their way," someone had shouted. "They'll get her out." But even as the sirens grew louder in the distance, we could all see that the trailer was burning too fast. The fire department might not make in time. That's when Joe had stepped forward. "Which room is she in?" he'd asked Sarah. "The back bedroom," Sarah had sobbed. "But Joe, you can't." Joe had already started walking toward the trailer. Martha had tried to grab his arm, but he'd gently pulled away. "Call 911 and tell them there's someone going in," he'd said calmly. "And get the garden hose ready." What happened next will be talked about in Riverside for years to come. Joe Peterson, the quiet mechanic who lived in the back of the trailer park, had run directly into a burning building to save a child who wasn't even his own. He'd disappeared into the smoke and flames while the rest of us stood there helplessly, and for the longest 2 minutes of my life, I'd thought I was going to lose him. When he'd emerged, carrying little Lily Henderson in his arms, both of them coughing and covered in soot, the entire crowd had erupted in cheers and tears. The fire department had arrived just as Joe had handed Lily over to her parents, and the paramedics had immediately started checking both of them for smoke inhalation. They'd both been fine, scared and smoky, but fine. "You saved her life," the fire chief had told Joe as they'd watched the firefighters finish putting out the blaze. Another few minutes, and Joe had just shrugged, like running into burning buildings was something he did every Tuesday. Anyone would have done the same thing, he'd said. But that wasn't true, and everyone there knew it. Most people would have waited for professionals. Most people would have assumed someone else would handle it. Most people would have been too afraid. Not Joe Peterson. As word of the fire spread throughout Riverside, something shifted in how people saw the couple from Trailer 47. The whispers and sideways glances were replaced by respectful nods and genuine smiles. The man who'd been dismissed as just another trailer park resident was suddenly recognized as a hero. But Joe and Martha hadn't changed. They were exactly the same people they'd always been. The only thing that had changed was that everyone else had finally seen them clearly. That's when I'd begun to understand something important about judgment, perception, and the difference between looking at someone and actually seeing them. The months following the fire had been transformative, not just for how the community saw Martha and Joe, but for how I saw myself. The hero worship that followed Joe's rescue of Lily Henderson had been intense, but brief. Within a few weeks, most people had moved on to other concerns. But the respect remained, and more importantly, the recognition that there was more to the Petersons than met the eye. I'd started high school that fall, and the transition from Roosevelt Middle School to Riverside High had given me a fresh start with most of my classmates. The story of my cafeteria speech had followed me, but so had the story of Joe's heroism, and somehow those 2 narratives had combined to create a version of me that I'd never been before, someone who was proud of where he came from and who he belonged to. Martha and Joe had noticed a change in me immediately. "You're walking taller these days," Martha had observed one evening as we'd worked together in the small garden she'd planted behind the trailer. Standing straighter. I guess I just feel different, I'd replied, carefully transplanting tomato seedlings the way she'd taught me. Different how? I'd thought about that question for a long time before answering. Like I belong somewhere. Like I'm not just passing through anymore. Martha had smiled, that warm smile that had confused me so much when I first arrived, but now felt like coming home. That's because you do belong, Marcus. You've always belonged. It just took you a while to believe it. High school had brought new challenges and new opportunities. I joined the debate team, discovered I had a talent for public speaking, and started thinking seriously about college for the first time in my life. My grades had always been decent, but now I was motivated by something beyond just getting by. I wanted to make Martha and Joe proud. It was during my junior year that I'd really begun to understand the full scope of what they'd given me. I'd been working on a project about social justice for my civics class when I'd stumbled across some statistics about foster care that had stopped me cold. Less than half of foster children graduate from high school. Less than 3% ever earn a college degree. The rates of homelessness, unemployment, and incarceration among former foster children were staggering. I'd brought the statistics home to Martha and Joe, spreading the printed pages across our small kitchen table. Did you know about this? I'd asked them about what happens to most kids who go through foster care. They'd exchanged one of their meaningful looks. We know, Joe had said quietly. Is that why you do it? Foster care? Because the odds are so bad. Martha had sat down across from me, her expression serious. We do it because every child deserves a chance, Marcus, and because we believe that love and stability can change those odds. But 17 kids, Martha, over 12 years. That's a lot of chances you've taken. And every single one has been worth it, she'd replied firmly. That's when I'd asked the question that had been building in my mind for months. What happened to them? The other kids who lived here? I'd expected awkward silence, maybe some deflection. Instead, Martha had gotten up and pulled a thick photo album from a drawer in the living room. Sit down, she'd said, patting the couch beside her. Let me tell you about your brothers and sisters. For the next 2 hours, Martha and Joe had walked me through the album, telling me stories about every child who'd passed through their home. There was Tommy, who'd lived with them for 6 months before being reunited with his grandmother. Sarah, who'd stayed for 2 years and was now studying nursing at Colorado State. David and Miguel, brothers who'd been adopted by a family in California but still sent Christmas cards every year. They all stayed in touch. I'd asked, amazed. Most of them, Joe had said. Once you're family, you're always family. There had been heartbreaks, too. Kids who'd been moved to other placements before Martha and Joe were ready to let them go. A teenager named Kevin who'd aged out of the system and disappeared, despite their efforts to stay connected. A little girl named Amy who'd been returned to biological parents who weren't ready to care for her properly. Does it hurt? I'd asked. When they leave? Every time, Martha had admitted. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. Love isn't guaranteed to last forever, Marcus, but that doesn't make it less real or less important while it's happening. That conversation had planted a seed in my mind that would eventually grow into my life's purpose. But first, I had to finish growing up, and that process had included some difficult lessons about the complexity of human nature and the persistence of prejudice. My senior year had brought college applications, scholarship essays, and the looming question of what came next. I'd been accepted to several universities, but the University of Colorado had offered me a full scholarship based on my academic performance and an essay about overcoming adversity. The scholarship had been announced at our senior award ceremony, in front of the entire school and dozens of parents. When they called my name and mentioned that I was graduating valedictorian, Martha and Joe had stood up in the audience and applauded like I just won the Nobel Prize. After the ceremony, as families gathered in the lobby for pictures and congratulations, I'd overheard a conversation that had reminded me that not everyone's perspective had changed as much as I'd hoped. It's really remarkable, Mrs. Patterson, Blake Morrison's mother, had been saying to another parent. To think that a boy from that background could achieve so much. Well, he must have gotten some good genes from somewhere, the other woman had replied. It certainly wasn't his environment that helped him. I'd felt the familiar burn of anger in my chest, the same feeling I'd had in the middle school cafeteria years earlier. But this time, I'd handled it differently. "Excuse me," I'd said, approaching the two women with Martha and Joe flanking me on either side. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about my background." Mrs. Patterson had looked embarrassed. "Oh, Marcus, congratulations on your scholarship. You were just suggesting that my success happened despite my environment, not because of it," I'd interrupted politely. "I wanted to make sure you understood that you're absolutely wrong." I gestured to Martha and Joe, who were standing behind me with proud smiles. "These are my parents, Martha and Joe Peterson. They've taught me everything that matters: how to work hard, how to treat people with respect, how to stand up for what's right, and how to love unconditionally. They've provided me with stability, support, and opportunities that many kids from wealthier families never receive." Mrs. Patterson had looked uncomfortable, but I'd continued. "My environment didn't hold me back. It prepared me for success by teaching me the value of perseverance, community, and authentic relationships. So yes, it is remarkable that I've achieved academic success. But not because I overcame my background, because my background gave me the foundation I needed to thrive." The conversation had ended there, but the impact had lingered. Word of my response had spread through the school's parent network, and I'd begun to realize that my role in changing perceptions about foster care and economic circumstances was far from over. Graduation day had been emotional for all of us. As I'd walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I'd looked out at the audience and seen Martha and Joe in the third row, both of them crying openly. In that moment, I'd understood something profound about the nature of family and success. I hadn't succeeded despite being a foster kid from Trailer Park. I'd succeeded because two people had believed in me enough to invest everything they had in my future. And that investment hadn't been financial. It had been emotional, spiritual, and relational. That night, as we'd celebrated at home with a cake Martha had made from scratch, I'd made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. "I want to go to law school," I'd announced over dinner. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Martha had said. "What kind of law interests you?" "Family law, child advocacy. I want to help kids in foster care, and I want to help families like us, families that people underestimate." Joe had reached across the table and shaken my hand solemnly. "That's good work, son. Important work. There's something else," I continued. "I want to tell our story. I want people to understand what foster care can be when it's done right, and I want them to see families like ours the way they really are." Martha had started crying again, but these were tears of joy. "We're so proud of you, Marcus," she'd said. "Not because of your grades or your scholarship or your plans for the future. We're proud because of who you've become, a young man who stands up for others and fights for what's right." That conversation had taken place 10 years ago. Now, standing in this conference room overlooking the Denver skyline, I was finally ready to fulfill the promise I'd made that night. The Henderson Foundation board members had filed into the conference room with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to making important decisions. There were 8 of them, representing one of Colorado's largest philanthropic organizations, and they controlled millions of dollars in grants for social service programs. Jennifer had introduced me with her usual professionalism, highlighting my academic achievements and legal experience, but keeping the focus on my expertise in child welfare law. What she didn't mention, what no one in the room except me knew, was that this presentation was about to become deeply personal. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd begun, standing at the head of the polished conference table. Thank you for considering increased funding for Colorado's foster care programs. Today, I want to share with you some research about the effectiveness of these programs. But more importantly, I want to tell you a story about the power of love, commitment, and seeing beyond surface appearances. I clicked to my first slide, which showed a photo of a rundown trailer park. 15 years ago, I was a 12-year-old boy with a garbage bag full of clothes and a heart full of anger. I'd been through 2 failed foster placements, and I was convinced that adults couldn't be trusted and that I'd never have a real family. The room had grown very quiet. This wasn't the standard presentation they'd expected. My caseworker drove me to Riverside Mobile Home Park and dropped me off at trailer number 47. The yard was cluttered, The basketball hoop was crooked, and everything about the place screamed poverty to my 12-year-old eyes. I clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of Martha and Joe from my high school graduation. These are Martha and Joe Peterson. When I first met them, I saw an overweight woman in a stained t-shirt and a thin man in a mechanic's uniform. What I didn't see, what it took me months to understand, was that I was looking at two of the most extraordinary people I would ever meet. For the next 20 minutes, I told them everything. About my initial embarrassment and suspicion. About the financial sacrifices Martha and Joe made to care for foster children. About the 17 kids who'd passed through their home over 12 years. About Joe running into a burning building to save a child. About Martha's informal network of community support that kept dozens of families afloat. The state of Colorado paid Martha and Joe Peterson $400 per month to care for me, I'd said, clicking to a slide that showed the actual costs of raising a child. The USDA estimates that it costs $1,230 per month on average to raise a child in a middle-income household. Martha and Joe made up the difference, $830 per month, nearly $10,000 per year, out of their own pockets. And they did it gladly. I'd seen several board members exchanging glances, and I'd known I had their attention. But the financial investment was nothing compared to the emotional investment. Martha and Joe didn't just provide me with food and shelter. They provided me with unconditional love, unwavering support, and a foundation of values that shaped who I became. I clicked to my final slide, which showed my law school graduation photo with Martha and Joe. I graduated valedictorian from Riverside High School. I earned my bachelor's degree magna cum laude from the University of Colorado. I graduated in the top 10% of my class from CU Law School. I've been practicing family law for 5 years, specializing in child advocacy and foster care reform. The room had been completely silent now, everyone leaning forward slightly. But here's what I want you to understand. None of that would have happened without Martha and Joe Peterson. Not because they had money, they didn't. Not because they had connections, they didn't. But because they had something more valuable than either of those things. They had the capacity to see potential where others saw problems, to offer love where others saw only obligation, and to invest in a future they might never see. I'd walked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. Every year in Colorado, hundreds of children age out of foster care with no permanent family connections. The statistics are devastating. 50% will be homeless within 2 years. 25% will be incarcerated within 5 years. Less than 3% will ever earn a college degree. I'd paused, letting those numbers sink in. But those statistics don't account for children who are placed with families like Martha and Joe, families that understand that foster care isn't about managing problems, it's about creating possibilities. Families that see beyond circumstances to potential. Families that love unconditionally and invest completely. I returned to my position at the head of the table. The Petersons are still fostering children. At ages 67 and 69, they're currently caring for 2 siblings whose parents are in rehabilitation. They've been doing this work for 22 years now, and they've never lost sight of what it's really about, giving children the gift of belonging. Several board members have been wiping their eyes. Your foundation has the opportunity to fund programs that identify, train, and support families like Martha and Joe. Families that don't fit the traditional profile of successful foster parents, but have the most important qualification of all: enormous hearts and unwavering commitment. I click back to the photo of the trailer park. Don't judge potential families by where they live, or what they drive, or how much money they make. Judge them by their capacity to love, their willingness to sacrifice, and their commitment to seeing every child as worthy of a permanent family. I looked around the room one more time. Martha and Joe Peterson changed my life not because they had resources, but because they had love. Your funding can help us find more families like them. Families that understand that the best investment you can make in a child's future isn't financial, it's relational. The room had erupted in applause, and I'd seen several board members openly crying. But the response that had mattered most had come from Dr. Elizabeth Henderson, the foundation's president. Mr. Williams, she'd said, standing up, that was the most powerful presentation I've heard in 15 years of philanthropic work. We came here today prepared to discuss a $500,000 grant. After hearing your story, I think we need to talk about $2 million. As the board members had filed out, making excited plans for follow-up meetings and program development, Jennifer had approached me with the expression of amazement. Marcus, she'd said, I had no idea. In 3 years of working with you, I never knew you were a foster child. It's not something I hide, I'd replied, but it's not usually relevant to my work. Today, it was everything. That evening, I'd driven out to Riverside to share the news with Martha and Joe. Trailer 47 looked exactly the same as it had 15 years ago. The yard was still cluttered, the basketball hoop was still crooked, and everything about the place still screamed poverty to eyes that didn't know how to look deeper. But now I knew the truth about appearances and reality, about judgment and understanding, about the difference between having money and being rich. $2 million? Martha had exclaimed when I'd told them about the foundation's decision. Marcus, that's wonderful. Think of all the families that money can help train and support. Think of all the kids who will get a chance because of it, Joe had added, pulling me into one of his fierce hugs. As we'd sat around the small kitchen table where I'd done homework for 6 years, eating cake and talking about the future, I'd realized that I'd finally completed the journey I'd started as an angry 12-year-old boy. I'd learned that family isn't defined by blood or wealth or social status. It's defined by choice, commitment, and unconditional love. I'd learned that home isn't a place. It's a feeling of belonging, of being wanted, of being valued for who you are rather than what you have or where you come from. Most importantly, I learned that the people we're quick to judge based on appearances are often the ones with the most to teach us about what really matters in life. Martha and Joe Peterson had given me more than a home. They'd given me a new understanding of human worth, family love, and the power of seeing beyond surface appearances to the heart of who someone really is. And now, thanks to the Henderson Foundation support, thousands of other children would have the chance to learn those same lessons from families just like mine. The people who had once mocked my foster parents would never understand what they had witnessed in that trailer park. They had seen poverty, dysfunction, and temporary arrangements. What they had missed was one of the most beautiful love stories ever written, not between two people, but between a family and every child who needed them. Some stories are worth waiting a lifetime to tell. This was mine, and it was just the beginning. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug, and see you soon.